Everyone for joining. This is part of the Lab to Impact CTL and IP and Commercialization series. The goal here is really to help highlight the journey from research and clinical insights to real-world innovations. This specific panel will focus on building bridges, bringing life sciences technologies to marketing through business development, but many of the same business development procedures are applicable across other industries as well. And so I'm going to give each of our panelists an opportunity to introduce themselves, how they came to their current role. And then we're going to go through a series of questions and topics focused both on inbound business development as well as outbound. We'll learn a bit more about the distinction between the two, as well as how business development is conducted in the venture capital space, as well as some miscellaneous topics. And if you have any questions that come up as we go along, we invite you to use the Q&A feature. If they're pertinent and I can leave them in, I'll try to do so. Otherwise, we'll try and save some general Q&A time at the end. So in no particular order, I will start with Aune Schlesinger.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this panel. My background is I've been in science since on my undergraduate years. After college, I did a stint in the Peace Corps in Morocco in public health, and then went on to do graduate work in developmental genetics. At that point, I decided I was interested in translational research, so I did a couple of postdoctoral positions looking into immunology and genomics and infectious diseases. And at the end of my postdocing, I transitioned away from the bench into the business side. So first I worked for one of the NIH clinical and translational science centers, building collaborations mostly between physicians and basic scientists to try to bring that translational element to the collaborations. And here at Novartis, I've always been on the academia industry interface, working to build collaborations and discussions with Novartis scientists and academics.
Great. Thank you very much. Happy to dive into some of those experiences. Richard.
Hi, thanks so much for the invitation to participate in this discussion, Jamie, and thanks for organizing this important event. So just a little bit about my background. So I earned my PhD in biomedical engineering at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And during my graduate program, this is where I had, my initial exposure to entrepreneurship, technology transfer. I took a number of elective business courses and I participated in some internships in the tech transfer program. So it's kind of my initial exposure to kind of the translational commercial side of research. And so over the years to follow until now, I held a number of different roles in technology transfer, at UNC Chapel Hill, also at Columbia University, and also here at Weill Cornell Medicine. And these roles ranged all the way from assessing innovations for commercial potential to IP portfolio management, to alliance management, to even out-licensing various assets, including in areas of therapeutics, medical devices, software, data, AI, and other areas. And so outside of tech transfer, I did spend a number of years at a university spinoff called Xilinx Bio, where I led business development efforts around developing an advanced preclinical drug testing platform based on tissue-derived extracellular matrix, or ECM, biomaterials. And a little over a year ago, I joined Merck's discovery transactions team, which I can talk a little bit more about later. But in my current role, I generally leverage my expertise in business development and licensing transactions to work closely with our scientists to establish strategic research collaborations. And so if we take a little bit of a step back following my journey from academic research to tech transfer to startup to industry, I feel like I've gained a diverse amount of perspectives from each of these roles. But the common thread throughout, all these roles is that I've always really been interested in advancing innovation and being very close to the science and really trying to, move, these innovations towards improving human health. So appreciate the opportunity to talk about my experience as well.
Thank you, Richard. And Ellis.
Thanks, Jamie. Excited to be here today with the other panelists. Similar background. So my background is in chemical and biological engineering. I started on the research side. I did my undergrad at CU Boulder. I'm from Colorado, and went into research after that. I bounced around a couple of different labs trying to find what I was excited about. Landed in regenerative medicine, and was in that space, regenerative medicine and tissue engineering for a few years. And in that experience, started getting connected to physicians and patients. I was working at a private lab that was looking to understand what are the sort of regenerative medicine opportunities that we could be taking advantage of based on the needs of patients and physicians, and how can we start bringing that into our translational research. And I realized that I really enjoyed the patient and physician interaction side of it, and I was excited to see how I could get more involved in the innovation entrepreneurship side. So I was looking around for a few different opportunities, ultimately decided to do my master's in the Netherlands. So I'm now based in Amsterdam. It was a master's of medical biology and innovation management. So that really helped make the shift over to the innovation side, and also really ground my experience in the medical side and understanding health systems and medical systems more deeply. And after that, I joined NLC, where I work now. NLC is a venture studio. I'm happy to go into a little bit more detail on that as we go. But I started at NLC as a venture developer, so being very deeply involved in the due diligence process, which means I interact a lot with physicians and engineers and innovators, of course, but also industry representatives, investors, those who work for strategics, trying to sit at the center of all of these different puzzle pieces of innovation to identify and then support promising early stage technologies, particularly in healthcare. And throughout the last couple of years, I've been with NLC for about 4.5 years. I have continued to transition also to supporting our portfolio more specifically in cardiovascular and imaging technologies, as well as managing a couple of the early stage ventures. Yeah, excited to talk today.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you all for those great introductions, and excited to get into things. Richard, I'm going to pick on you first. I do want to hark back a bit to your time at Columbia, so one of our peer institutions here at the city. And I think, as we think about big portfolios and helping manage and think about inventors and their science, as you were working with the inventors in your focus areas, how did you work with them to think about distilling a value proposition for a technology or a platform or a data set, some sort of asset that might be interesting to the industry?
Yeah, great. Thanks for the question, Jamie. So I think it's important to kind of from the tech transfer perspective understand, that research is typically very early stage. And so as early stage research assets, it's really important to kind of frame any kind of innovations around some kind of unmet need, what kind of problem, we're intending to solve, and how you actually frame and communicate that value to whoever your target stakeholders might be. So, typically in, business, we'll think about like what is better, faster, cheaper. How do you kind of, frame any kind of innovation in that sense? So, typically the coaching that is around these types of early stage assets may be around kind of a pitch for opportunities for funding, typically like as if this were potentially going to be a startup for additional de-risking. So really trying to frame these kind of innovations under like, how do we visualize this opportunity or innovation in the marketplace as a technology, a product, a service? Also, what kind of milestones need to be met to enable, these types of technologies to actually get to the market? Are there developmental milestones or regulatory milestones that we need to address and understand? So yeah, being early stage assets, coaching the researchers and understanding these types of aspects of innovation, I think is important so that we can frame this appropriately for either potential startup spinouts for future funding, or potentially for other commercial partners to partner with them.
Great. I think that makes a lot of sense. And one specific follow-up question, sometimes it's very obvious what the technology or potential technologies may be when you get a new invention disclosure or there's a new Nature publication. sometimes it can be a little harder. Maybe it's more basic science. How do you think would you and suggest that inventors think through maybe the applications of even what they're doing in basic research that might be appealing to the Novartises and the Mercks of the world?
Yeah, I think data are important to show, and I think proof of concept data is always good to kind of visualize what the envisioned, use case of any kind of innovation is. So I think data really is important. So I also, on the same light, feedback from industry partners or potential commercial partners on what that actually is, and being, open and listening to what that, those types of milestones might be, to kind of get to the next step. I think is also very important just to kind of make sure that there's a little bit of an alignment on what particular use case or application that technology might fit into.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And feedback is something that we find particularly insightful because sometimes a no can be as helpful as a yes if it helps you guide to the next steps in either de-risking or maybe another inflection point. Or maybe you test your molecule in a specific animal model. So yes, we are always welcome to feedback from industry partners in our network. Maybe one or two more questions here before we really more focused on the corporate side of things. How do you think about when you have a platform or a technology, if it might make more sense to approach existing companies more as a partnership or licensing, or to put that into, say, a startup vehicle where you might be going out and seeking funding?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And this is from the perspective of the company or from an
Let's say
academic
from the academic perspective, you have an interesting technology. Should this be a startup or should this maybe should we pursue this through partnership with existing companies?
Yeah, I would say from the academic perspective, I think one depends on the type of opportunity or technology, right? So what are actually the limits of what you can do within the bounds of academic research with the resources that you have? So I think that would kind of, differentiate what, maybe there's certain, projects that you may be able to do either with industry sponsored research towards a specific goal or with federal funding. But if there is feedback that there are certain de-risking types of aspects of the innovation that need to be done in a startup, for example, maybe clinical partnerships or trials that might have to be done. These are kind of things that need to be considered, and if it's worth potentially spinning out a startup. So I think the tech transfer offices are great as a resource to kind of guide these types of decisions as well, with the feedback that understanding what the landscape looks like, and how to position these types of discussions. So yeah, I guess that's kind of my perspective on that.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I would say one thing that we see is sometimes it can be industry or dependent. Ellis, I'm going to call on you. I'd say we've noticed that often in the medical device or cardiovascular space, there is a lot of startup activity rather than, say, a direct license from an academic institution to Medtronic, for example. I was wondering if you have also have seen that through your work in the space and any ideas why that may be a bigger focus on startup creation in that space.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the word that we tend to use as a catch-all is venturable. So whether or not a technology can be a standalone venture, or whether or not it indeed needs to be more of a partnership or licensing agreement. One of the things that we notice, especially in cardiovascular, which is of course a little bit biased by our focus, which tends to be the higher class implantable devices. Many of these technologies are quite suitable for venturing because they are a full proposition in themselves. There's a device that has its own workflow that can be implemented, relatively independently of a lot of the other technologies that might exist in, for example, a cath lab or an OR. Where we tend to find some challenges with determining whether or not something is worth or valuable as a sort of standalone venture, or whether or not it's more of a partnership opportunity, is often in the digital side. Digital and, of course, AI has been a lot. And where you often see a distinction here is, are the innovations a product, or are they a feature? So we see a lot of innovations, for example, around image segmentation or improving a user interface, or sort of improving a component of a workflow. And often those require either proprietary access to technologies that already exist. They require sort of specific integrations into a workflow that it's very hard for a standalone entity to have access to, or especially from sort of the economic standpoint, it's challenging to build a business case around a perhaps very important feature, but something that is a smaller part of a much bigger process. And those are typically the candidates then that make the most sense to approach some of these potential partners sooner and see if there's a way to integrate those into an existing portfolio.
Great, thank you. And I like the adjective venturable. I was using startupable, but venturable is much more easier to say. It flows off the tongue much better. So thank you for that. All right, I want to now pivot a bit to the corporate side of things. And Anne, I'm going to start with you. So both you and Richard do sit in the earlier side of the discovery or early transaction part of the ED&L infrastructure at your respective companies. So Anne, I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit about what are the goals of your the early strategic partnerships team, and how does that fit into the broader BD&L ecosystem at Novartis?
Well, at Novartis, we actually have two teams that look at external innovation. I'll start with my team, which is academic partnerships and external innovation. We'll get specifically towards early stage opportunities in academia. So our sweet spot is this concept of co-creative collaboration, where we build collaborations where everybody brings something to the table. And so within the broader ecosystem, we're very focused in the space of helping the Novartis scientists in the early stage areas build their pipeline. And we also have a business development team that looks at startups and biotechs. So they're looking at something very, very different, later stage assets. And while our questions that my team looks to fulfill are really very basic, usually we're just interested in engaging with innovators within academia who are looking at the pathomechanisms driving the diseases that we're trying to treat. Our colleagues in what we call corporate and business development, they're looking for assets that have a certain level of validation that can be brought in to supplement our pipeline. So we have these two teams that are distinct really because our goals are completely different and how we fit into the strategy are different. And they found it easier to create the two teams to drive early and late stage engagement with external innovators rather than keep the two together because strategically we're so different.
Got it. Yeah, no, that does make a lot of sense. And I think that is often similar for other big pharmas that I've interacted with, though each one is a bit unique. I guess I'd be curious specifically at Novartis, what are some of the different ways in which academic institutions would engage with you?
So my team has a core approach, which is to partner with business teams at universities so that we form these long-term partnerships. So mostly I interact with teams such as yours because we can leverage your understanding of what the faculty are doing, where their research is headed. And we can draw a lot of information from publicly available information such as publications and grants. But really what we're interested in is not only what researchers have done in the past and where their core expertise lies, but also in where they're going. So we also have business teams that reach out to us directly. We call these more opportunistic outreach. And we work with them to assess specific opportunities. Usually when they reach out, they have the one-pagers that cover technologies rather than PI expertise. But even those are really good starting points for discussions around where certain labs or certain groups of labs are headed and how we can work together to tackle disease. But mostly it's through these long-term relationships that we build with specific universities.
Got it. Thank you. That makes sense. And on the Novartis side, how do you approach, or how does the organization approach deciding what your wish list is and what your focus areas will be for this collaboration? Novartis is, of course, a very large organization covering many different therapeutic areas. So I assume that's a arduous process, but would love to learn more.
It's actually one of my favorite parts of my job. So I work within, I guess you could call it a smaller part of Novartis. In fact, I believe you and your colleagues are constantly mentioning Novartis colleagues I've never heard of because it is such a big organization. So it's nice to be, I'm part of biomedical research. So it's about 7,500 scientists and business colleagues. And we are constantly checking in with our scientists to see what they need in order to drive their pipeline projects. And our scientists are all drawn for academia. They're all very excitable in terms of scientific innovation. And there's always so much going on in the academic ecosystem that really one of my jobs is to ensure that when we reach out to partner, we are linking this with strategy, because we really want to engage with academics when there is a good probability that we will move forward and engage in a collaboration. So there's an awful lot of discussion around internal projects and the gaps there. And that is a continuous discussion, although, we have a business cycle. So towards the end of the year, Novartis reviews where the portfolio progressed that year, and then we start planning the strategy for next year. So right around the turn of the year, there's a deep dive into what was accomplished in terms of academic partnering and what still needs to be done.
That makes sense. And as you're thinking through internal versus external innovation, what goes into that decision? Should we try and do this in-house with our own scientists, or should we try and do this maybe through collaboration?
So one of the key aspects there is how mature our internal capabilities are. So we can only hire so many people. And so a lot of our partnerships are around questions, our academic partnerships are around questions where we haven't built internal expertise. The other is really about essentially how much innovation we're looking for. I mean, my scientists have a lot of leeway within Novartis to drive their research and to try to really be innovative, not only in their approaches, but also the questions that they ask. But they do have to really stick to the pipeline project needs. So a lot of academic partnerships are built around academic innovation where a faculty member really took a foundational scientific approach to the next level that we couldn't have done internally. So pushing the limit on some of the technologies or some of the investigations into disease where we just don't have the capabilities of doing that internally.
Got it. That makes sense. And so let's say one of our researchers has identified a promising new target in a pathway that overlaps with an indication of interest for Novartis. Do they need to wait? Does the scientist need to wait until they've already maybe developed some molecules or probes to interrogate that target? Or does Novartis partner at that earlier, I would say, scientific juncture?
So that really depends on the scientific team. Some of the therapeutic areas are very interested in going early. And so sometimes they're less interested in the target per se than the pathway, less interested in a therapeutic than in a tool candidate that they could work with the academic to modulate the pathway so that they can really understand the disease better. A lot of times when we bring in candidates or assets, that's usually through CMBD because those require a higher level of validation. But for earlier target validation, a lot of times it's less about does the faculty member have a therapeutic than can we really understand in a translatable way how this target could be manipulated in order to impact the disease. unfortunately, the final question which you asked is, when should a faculty member reach out? It really depends. And so I think it's worthwhile for the faculty member to always ping an industry partner and get, as you said, this sort of feedback on, even if it's too early, perhaps what next steps should they take in order to bring it up to the point where the industry partner would be interested.
Great. Yeah, that makes sense. And the WCM Enterprise Innovation Team is, of course, happy to help facilitate those interactions and advise our faculty and students on what can we talk about at this juncture, what would we need to talk about, maybe under a confidentiality agreement, et cetera. We're very used to facilitating that type of interaction. Before we maybe pivot over to learning how things are run at Merck, and I did notice that Novartis recently announced a collaboration with a Helmholtz Munich, so I think it's a nonprofit institution in Germany. And it looks like that is really around building a kidney disease atlas, including biological data, AI, et cetera. If you're familiar with that collaboration, would love to learn a bit more and what Novartis hopes to get out of these type of collaborations with an academic or institute partner.
Well, this is a really exciting collaboration because it addresses so many things. I mean, fundamentally, we're interested in translational research. And historically, a lot of that research has been done with non-mammalian preclinical models, where we have been really great at curing cancer in mice. But unfortunately, those findings don't translate into humans. So this collaboration is around human-derived organoids. And this is where Novartis has a lot of expertise. We have highly sophisticated renal complex models that we've been using internally for our pipeline projects. But this collaboration enables us to, instead of using these models to answer specific questions, to query the models about the mechanisms of renal disease. And what Helmholtz Munich brought to the table was experience having applied AI modeling to understand cellular function within tissues. So they've done virtual cell simulations, and they've also done large-scale perturbation analyses that are now being brought to bear on our kidney organoids that will enable us to understand, based on human genetics, how renal disease progresses.
Very cool. And so what would you hope would be the outcomes of a successful collaboration at the end of this 4 years?
We're really focused on ensuring that all participants involved in the collaboration have outcomes that benefit them. So we're really looking forward to this being a paper, to the publication, because we think that the knowledge that's going to be derived from this is going to be very informative for researchers all over who are looking to better understand renal disease. Internally, we'd like to be able to use this to perhaps decrease animal studies and to really have a model that allows us to understand how the disease behaves in humans so that we can translate some of our pipeline projects more directly and quickly.
Got it. That makes sense. And yeah, you mentioned that publication is a shared goal. It might not always be. So I'm just curious, industry and academia, while there can be scientific overlap, occasionally there can be differences in what your goals are long term. You want to develop products, even if they impact patient care. So how do you manage that potential conflict of, I want to publish, we don't want to publish, we can keep this confidential, not confidential? How do you handle that in the context of these industry academic collaborations?
Well, at my level, most of the collaborations that we do yield publishable data. Sometimes it's not all publishable. So we just have an upfront conversation with the academic partner. And this is where we really bring in the academic business partner also, so that in the end, everybody has aligned and agreed upon what will be shared, what will not be shared, who can use what, and what gets published. Really, transparency at the very beginning of the discussion is essential here.
Got it. Thank you. And I'm just going to call in Ellis quickly before we pivot to Richard. So when you are working with your portfolio companies, and we'll get back into more of your structure, how do you manage, you need to publish enough on your products to so people can see there's non-confidential information out there, but you still want to keep a little close to the chest so you're not necessarily giving your competitors too much intel. How do you suggest your portfolio companies, who often have at least some academic co-founders, manage that divide?
Yeah, this is always one of the big questions, especially in the early translational phases. I first and foremost is, of course, to make sure that IP protection is in place. That's always the first thing that we recommend. But from there, we tend to encourage, especially academic co-founders, we encourage to be more open and sort of start conversations earlier than they might otherwise expect, because we typically find that yields pretty early benefits for potential partners to understand what's going on in the space, get to know the team, get to know the technology, and start building that relationship over time. So often it's a bit of a balance between, as you mentioned, not being too sort of open about what you're doing, but also having enough of a presence in a landscape that companies can follow you, they can see progress, they can see what you've been working on, and also they'll sort of get back to you when you start to hit a range that you might be an opportunity for a collaboration or an investment or whatever the case may be. The other thing that we also try and sort of have our co-founders keep in mind is a lot of the time the in-person presence at a lot of these events is going to be just as important as having, for example, an online or an academic presence. We find that much of the sort of the connections and progress that our portfolio companies make are at either investor conferences or, especially in the early stages, sort of specific conferences in a therapeutic area. My experience at the moment is, of course, more in cardiovascular, and there's an interesting mix in the cardiovascular space of having a few really high-profile conferences where all of these people are together. So you have top KOLs and physicians, but you also have top investors, top strategics with their business development teams, and they're all in the same place. And that's usually where most of the conversations and connections are made. And that also sort of reduces the bar to needing to find that balance for how much to share versus how much to protect. Because, again, you build those relationships, of course, make sure that you have NDAs or CDAs in place when you need, but then really be upfront about building those relationships sooner rather than later, so that you can get that support at the time that you need it.
Got it. Yeah, I think that's very helpful advice. And we also find, doing business development for the WCM portfolio, that attending those conferences, just having so many people in one place, can be a really great way to efficiently make a lot of connections that you can then follow up on later. Richard, so we've heard a bit of how Novartis structures their BD&L. Be curious to learn a bit more about the discovery transactions team and how that fits into the broader picture at Merck.
Yeah, absolutely. And similar as a larger company, there are clearly kind of structures and different teams in place. So our business development team, our division essentially is we have about 9 areas, and discovery transactions is one of these areas. The other areas include, we have a competitive intelligence team to ensure that we are aligning external insights with internal strategies. We have a search and evaluation team trying to identify potential partnership opportunities that are aligned with our strategies. There's a corporate transactions team, which are focused on larger, more commercial facing or M&A types of agreements. And this also includes alliance management teams who may manage some of the post-agreement types of governance types of matters. So the discovery transactions team really supports our Merck Research Laboratories scientists, and we work to establish collaborations with external partners, could be academics, biotechs, other types of partners, and really for these, the stages, early discovery, preclinical research opportunities. And so we function as a science-first type of strategy. We're driven by science. Our Merck Research Laboratory scientists are the ones who are aligned with our strategy under our one pipeline, capital Z, capital O, capital P pipeline. And we function as one team to try to make sure that our functional units are aligned with the strategy. So typically, while we may have different areas, we all are aligned under our scientists and the strategies that we have moving forward for any of these opportunities.
Got it. No, that makes sense. And so for the potential transactions or collaborations that are coming across your desk, are those sourced from your scientists? Are you sourced them directly, a little column A, column B?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Typically, the best way that agreements come on our desk in the discovery transaction space is that they are typically something that our scientists will identify potentially, in scientific forums, conferences or congresses. Maybe there's particular events where there might be disease or area specific kind of science that's presented, and we engage in some kind of potential collaboration that we want to structure. So I'd say a lot of the drive is from our scientists from where we sit, but we also have our search and evaluation team, which may also identify certain opportunities that could fit into some kind of research collaboration for discovery research. So we kind of work both in both areas, but I would say the most efficient way to kind of establish the collaboration is, working with our scientists to ensure that there's alignment with our strategy internally.
Got it. Thank you. That makes sense. And just looking at some of the recent press releases, it seems like Merck has been actively investing externally in AI or in AI-enabled solutions or platforms. A couple that I saw and we spoke briefly about were one with Tempest, which is a New York City-based company, as well as a collaboration with Mayo Clinic as their own sort of platform of de-identified data. I'll leave it up to you which, if any of those you would like to speak about, but be curious how AI is such a big topic, how Merck is approaching partnership and diligence to ensure that what an AI space is actually providing a value add to Merck's discovery or clinical teams.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think we're not unique that everybody in this space is really trying to leverage the capabilities of AI, particularly for decision making. And with that, I think, there's an increased value in what clinical data can bring to these types of decision making through the leveraging of the use of AI capabilities. We even have a group internally that's called the Data, AI, and Genome Sciences Group, which really focuses on curating high quality clinical data so that we can enable insights, particularly for identifying maybe potentially new biomarkers, discovering other types of therapeutics that we might be able to target within our capabilities. So we kind of see the importance of data and accessing these data, and even on the other side of institutions realizing these value of these data and trying to find ways and mechanisms to allow access, us to access these data, I think is also somewhat of a challenge in some institutions to ensure that everything is properly able to be transferred or accessed. And so, yeah, this is an area where I think there's a lot of growth. And I think for us, we understand the value of these data in our decision-making processes, and hopefully these lead to a lot more effective therapeutics for particular therapeutic areas that we might be working in.
Got it. That makes sense. And just in general, with not getting into specifics, how do you think about ascertaining the value of some of these external platforms and how that value may be created or generated? I guess I'm specifically thinking about there's the cost of doing the work or doing the access, but let's say a hypothetical, you use an AI platform, you discover a drug, that drug is a Merck blockbuster. Do you ever think about structuring partnerships in a way where maybe the AI platform holder would get some sort of payment or read through on future drugs, or are you primarily interested in just structuring a collaboration around the specific research goals and not really thinking about back end?
Yeah, that is a good question. I'm not sure if I have much expertise in the perspective of the structuring of these types of transactions. I will say, the ability for us to enable us to make more, better decisions on identifying, what's downstream of these types of collaborations, I think is important. And ultimately, I think something, if we take a step back for us, something that is of, part of our drive, and what we always remember is that the patient is always in the room when we're making our decisions, and we express urgency for any of the decisions that we make down the road. So, as long as we're all aligned that, we want to get safe and effective drugs for certain these certain therapeutic indications where there might be applicability for these AI platforms, that's kind of where, our drive is to ensure that these therapeutics get to these patients as quickly as possible. So yeah, I'm not sure if I answered your question. It's a little bit of I think that these are discussions that are kind of ongoing, and trying to understand how to structure these appropriately. But it is a good question, and I think something to continue discussing as we move along.
Got it. Thank you. Anne, I wanted to circle back to Novartis and recognizing that the search and evaluation on the biotech and existing company front is a separate team. But just curious in general as to what is that process like? What is the diligence process like? And when might Novartis start to become interested in, say, a early clinical stage asset that falls within a therapeutic area of interest?
Okay, this is where I'm going to evoke the, as you said at the beginning, the I don't know clause. So I can give you a little bit of background, but again, my focus is more on the earlier stage. I think that fundamentally, it's the validation of the target in the disease area. So just because you can modulate a target doesn't mean that it's going to impact disease progression. And the second is really understanding how far the therapeutic itself has been validated in terms of safety, in terms of PK/PD. So these are the generalities that I can tell you, but never having done one of these due diligences, I'm really not best placed to answer that question, I regret.
No, understood. And Richard, recognizing that again, you sit on a similar place, but any thoughts or insight into the Merck diligence process that you'd like to share? If not, we can move on to a different question.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think primarily, our search and evaluation team, again, they are in the room with our Merck Research Laboratories leadership teams to really identify and align on these strategies. We align, good science, great science with strategy. And so if there is an alignment, we really want to see, we take this science first approach, and we want to, the more data and proof of concept that we can see, and the closer to the clinic, these data are, the more excited that we will be to look and evaluate these types of technologies, and so or innovations or therapeutics. So I think in general, like I would say the process is, we're agnostic, and we look at great science. And it doesn't really matter, I guess, the source, whether it's academic, biotech, or pharma, of, the potential opportunity. It does, I would also echo what Anne was saying. It depends on the therapeutic area. It depends on the type of, technology. For example, if they're risky assets that have a high failure rate, we may, require additional more data to show that there's potential, for these types of assets. Or maybe there's an oncology asset that we may be able to take earlier because we see, based on these data, proof of concept data, that there's potentially promising good science that's backing up, these decisions. So in general, I guess, again, I probably will repeat this multiple times, but I think, our core strategy really is, fundamentally, we are focused on great science, and we want to ensure that that is aligned with are areas that we might even be working on ongoing research in, for example, in oncology, inflammation, neuroscience, these typical areas, or potentially outside of these areas for something that may enable us to develop therapeutics in these areas. So yeah, I'm not sure if that answers your question, but hopefully it gives a bit of perspective from our end.
Yeah, for sure. I think that does. And just for the audience, if you're interested in learning more about these type of collaborations or MA activities, resources like Fierce Biotech can be a good way to learn about these type of transactions that are occurring and at what various stages. It's very interesting, like Richard said, it can be very different depending on the specific target or the specific therapeutic area. If it has to be a phase 3 ready asset or if it's even preclinical and the value that is associated with those. So I would like to transition and just briefly, Richard, touch on your experience at Xilex Bio. So I think it's a good opportunity to look at the other side of business development. So we were just speaking mostly about inbound business development to Novartis and Merck. But then for a company that does have its own products and is looking to get out there and sell or get out there and partner with other entities, similar but slightly different hat. So I'm just wondering if you could speak in general to, when you were at Xilex Bio, what were the business development goals of the small to mid-sized biotech that has a few products market?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so maybe I'll switch my hat to, from the startup mode. So at the stage that I was at the company's Alex Bio, it initially started out as a research tools company, really leveraging their technology based on extracellular matrix or ECM-based biomaterials. And so initially, as a research tools company, the goal of the business development goals were really to try to seek strategic partnerships with scientific researchers to demonstrate proof of concept in specific types of preclinical, in vitro models for specific research applications. So initially, the approach was to do a kind of a not say direct to consumer or direct to researcher type of model where, going either to offering these types of research tools to researchers to conduct additional research showing different applications of the tools was important, even going through potentially distribution channels to allow these products to be available globally. And I would say, as time went on and we gained additional feedback during my time when I was there, there were expansions into other business development areas where we, developed a drug testing platform whereby we could then, leverage kind of a service kind of business model where we would approach, pharma companies or contract research organizations doing drug testing and offer services to conduct, drug testing through our assays. And so, in each of these cases, as an early startup, trying to leverage and show in specific cases where there's applications of our technology, I think was important to make sure that also that we're, understanding that there's, market feedback. What are our customers saying about our products, and what areas are there open to, specific unique value propositions? For example, potentially in studying metastatic cancer in vitro models, which is pretty challenging to kind of model from that space. So yeah, I don't know if that is at least something to start with. So
Yeah, and I think that's a very helpful overview, and maybe just one or two probes before we move on to other topics. So I was just looking through some of the historical press releases on the Xilex Bio website, and there was an interesting partnership or co-creation with an entity called Sweet Chemistry Skincare. So it looked like it was potentially an application of some of the original or maybe improved IP to a different industry. Just curious, how that came about and what led to the impetus to consider some of this, at least university made in part IP in the cosmetic space.
yeah, this is a great question. So I think in this particular case, the strategy was to try to expand into leverage the technology to expand in another vertical. Identifying that there is value in the extracellular matrix biomaterials in applications in skincare, was of interest. And, we had a partner that was also interested in leveraging the technology as well. This strategy really was, trying to again, leverage our technology, try to expand another vertical for increased revenue generation, expanding to a different target market. But as clearly this is a different type of business model going into the consumer market. So really leveraging the expertise of the partner to try to drive this collaboration forward, I think was an important decision point at that point.
Got it. Thank you. Yeah, and this is also, when you have a platform, there's potential for maybe many different non-overlapping use cases. That's something that in our office that is not unusual, that maybe we would seek multiple partners to a platform and then focus those collaborations maybe on a specific field of use. Or in the instance of maybe we're starting a new company, like you mentioned, maybe it'll be through further collaboration through another party or sub-licensing to fully enable and realize all the potential of a platform. So very interesting. Ellis, thank you for being patient a little bit as we save some of the VC questions for the end of the panel. We've touched on it a little bit, but NLC has an interesting model. So I was wondering if you could speak briefly to the NLC model and where you fit within the innovation ecosystem.
Absolutely. Excuse me. Yeah, so we are a venture studio and early stage investor. So we are typically involved at the point or just after sometimes the point of company creation. We're often working with academic centers, typically, of course, universities and research hospitals, but also some of the strategics. So around 30% of our work and the companies in our portfolio come from strategic IP. So from companies either that have IP that is no longer strategically interesting for them, but that they want to see forward, or that it's too risky or too expensive for them to develop in-house. So they spin it out. We're usually involved preclinically, and as a note, my comments are coming more from the medtech side than the biotech side, but we do have a biotech team that focuses specifically on those assets as well. But typically based on preclinical data, usually where there's proof of concept, there's early validation that a technology might work. And we step in at that point, create a company around the technology, in-license the technology from the IP holder. We have a talent acquisition team and activity that we use, of course, to find either a CEO or a team sometimes to either support the founders or to bring a leader for the new company to sometimes build a team from scratch. We put in some initial capital, and then we support the company from that stage up until an exit, whether that's an IPO, an acquisition. Sometimes, of course, that means the company doesn't make it. We get involved in the very early stages. We know that a lot of our portfolio won't ultimately hit the market, but we have a very long-term vision for our sport, and we expect to be involved with the companies that we start anywhere between 5 and 10 years, typically. And we focus on a couple of areas. So I mentioned biotech, mostly therapeutics, a little bit also of IVD. And then in the medtech space, cardiovascular and imaging, where I sit. And we also have a team that focuses on both orthopedics and minimally invasive surgery.
Good. Thank you. And when you or your team have identified a program of interest, what is the general diligence process like before you get to that initial invention and negotiation of the license with the academic or whomever partner?
Yeah, so the way I usually summarize it is we look at 3 key aspects. We look at clinical, technical, and commercial. We always start with clinical. So our due diligence is always focused around what is the clinical unmet need? Asking questions like, is that recognized across different geographies or across different centers? Or is it something that perhaps a physician in a center is struggling with just themselves? Also understanding what are the other technologies in use and what are some of the shortcomings or challenges of those. And looking at the workflow. Where would a new technology sit in that workflow? And does it make life easier, or at least not that much harder for a physician or a user of that technology? Technical, of course, that's where we spend a lot of time with the inventing team, understanding on one end what is the IP protection and what is the strategy moving forward, but also what is the level of validation of the technology, what is that compared to, what are the technical risks that still exist moving forward, and what is the plan to mitigate those risks. And then, of course, commercial. So understanding what is the go-to-market strategy, what is the business model, how does it compare to competitors, and importantly, what is the capital need in order to get those technologies further? Because sometimes, of course, those can be very expensive, and then, of course, the upside for the healthcare system also needs to be pretty significant at the end as well. And we do all of this with a number of external partners. So especially clinically, we have a pretty close-knit group of key opinion leaders and physicians in different countries, and also that focus on different aspects of, in my case, for example, cardiovascular care and innovation that we sit with. For example, I'm sometimes in cases with these physicians to really understand what is their reality. And then, as I mentioned, we also work closely with other investors in our network, as well as the strategics, to understand what are they looking at in the future, what are the inflection points that they would want to see as a technology develops for it to be interesting for them, and at what stage would be a right point or moment to open a door to a relationship. And we bring all of that into our due diligence process. And I would also say it's quite fluid. So a lot of the conversations that we have in that early due diligence process are also the partnerships that we're developing around that company, also to support it once it hopefully becomes a venture, so that we're really starting these companies that already have a bit of an ecosystem built around them.
Great, thank you. Recognizing that time flies, we only have a couple minutes left, so give each of the panelists a chance to say any closing remarks. Or words of wisdom for our academic community. Anne, would you like to go first?
Well, thanks for having me on the panel. I would just say that for academic researchers to continuously work with your business team to understand industry engagement. As a former academic myself, I realized that I wasn't really prepared how to interface with the industry to portray my research at its best. So I would put that out there as my one piece of wisdom.
Thank you. Yeah, the enterprise innovation CTL teams are here to help and your thought partner for your early innovations or ideas. Richard.
Thanks so much for again, organizing this discussion. I'd say we are really interested in working with scientific researchers from academic institutions. The best way, some parting words is speak to our Merck scientists when you see them at conferences, and also work with your technology transfer teams to try to connect with us. And if you're interested in learning more about the areas of ongoing research that we have, I'd encourage you to look at merck.com/research, and it'll kind of outline areas that we're interested in that are of ongoing research, but also at the end of the day, if you have really good science and have promising data, we're always interested in learning about what you're working on. So thanks again, and appreciate it.
Great, and then last, Ellis.
Yeah, I would say it's always helpful to remember that innovation is rarely successful alone. So my feedback and my advice is always talk to as many people as you can as early in the process as you can. If you're an academic researcher developing something for the medical field, talk to clinicians, talk to your colleagues, try to get as much feedback and advice in those early stages as you can to understand really who is the user of your technology and what is the impact that you're trying to make, to really build that kind of end in mind perspective from the very beginning. And I think that also extends onto the partnerships that you might be able to make later. So it's rarely too early to at least reach out. You might get some no's, you might get ghosted by some companies or some investors. But as much feedback as you can get in the early stage is always useful to have, and it's always worth that effort to start building those relationships. So I would always say start building that network earlier than you might think is necessary. And thanks again, Jamie, for the panel. It was a really insightful discussion.
Great. Well, thank you to our three panelists for joining us today. This was great to learn about your unique perspectives and how your organizations sit within the innovation ecosystem. So I think we will leave you there to get on with your days. And thank you to all the attendees for joining and listening.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Bye.